Well, good morning, good afternoon, folks. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are going to go ahead and get started. You will notice that the session is being recorded and will be shared for participants that weren't able to attend us. If you are not comfortable having your screens on due to that, definitely feel comfortable to turn them off. But of course, we always love for folks to have their videos on so we can kind of see friendly faces and just have a chance to interact as we go forward. I'm going to go ahead and get started. Cassandra, if you're able to go to the next slide. My name is Seth Spencer, and I'm the Teach Climate Network Coordinator for Climate Generation. I'm coming to you from Apple Valley, Minnesota, which is the traditional and contemporary home of the Dakota and Anishinaabe. We take time to acknowledge the native land that we are on because one of the effects of genocide and colonization is that it can be easy to forget that we are still occupying land and that Indigenous individuals and communities are still alive and leading change in our world. We recognize the tremendous resilience and innovative climate solutions that are created by these communities and seek to raise up their voices in climate change education. We are proud of the incredible diversity of our country and know that our vision for an equitable future will only be achieved when we are all working together, bridging experiences and expertise from across the globe. I think that by this point, many of us are aware of the native lands that we are occupying or on. If you're not, I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat here. And so feel free to investigate that. Because we are sharing our climate stories, or talking about climate stories, which can be very personal, we do have some community agreements that we want to kind of agree upon today. The first is listening to understand, making space and taking space. We will have a chance to kind of share a little bit about where we're coming from and the experiences that we have. Being open to learning, and of course, valuing the process as much as the outcome. A big one that I sometimes have challenges with, which is assuming best intent and attend to impact, making sure you're taking space for self-care and community care. And of course, hopefully you'll enjoy this experience today. And at this point, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to pass it along to my colleague, Cassandra, to introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'll introduce myself a little bit more thoroughly in a moment, but I wanted to start by just framing what we're going to do today. We're going to start off with a little bit of introductions and an overview of our journey today, and then we'll do a little bit of a creative activity. So I hope everyone has a writing utensil or some paper handy. Then we will talk about climate stories and climate storytelling in the broader context of climate change before going in to talk more about climate stories in the context of education and in the classroom. And then we'll have a little bit of time to reflect and discuss what we hope to, do moving forward after we've gone through this knowledge sharing today. And I'll save some time at the end for question and answer. So as I said, my name is Cassandra Ceballos. My pronouns are she, her, and they, them. I am the Talk Climate Manager at Climate Generation, which means I lead our climate storytelling work and community engagement work. I am originally from the ancestral lands of the Taino, or modern-day St. Croix, United States Virgin Islands, but currently I am working on the ancestral lands of Piscataway and Susquehanna peoples in Baltimore, Maryland. So because we're going to be talking about climate stories today, I thought it would be apt to start with a little bit about my climate story and how I've come to sit in front of you today. And I would be nothing without the place that I am from. I'm a 9th generation Crucian, which is what you call somebody from St. Croix. And I remember as early as 7 years old, seeing the coral reefs on my island change, because I was lucky enough to be able to enjoy the natural environment from a young age. I like to tell people that I experienced my first Category 5 hurricane from my mother's womb. My mom was 8.5 months pregnant with my twin sister and I when Hurricane Marilyn hit, and the island, didn't have power for a while. And, that was, very precarious to be pregnant during that time. And things have only gotten worse in the nearly 3 decades since. More specifically, though, it is the farmers and the earth tenders of the Virgin Islands that truly inspired me to get into climate change and environmentalism. When I was in high school, I wrote a poem about the farmers on St. Croix that won an island-wide contest. And I don't say that to brag. I just say that as a part of my resumes. Storytelling has just been a long part of my life, and it is something that I'm very passionate about. And I hope that even if you don't consider yourself a writer, that you leave here knowing that your voice matters and that we all have a climate story to tell. And that truly there's passion there. So I'd like to start with in chat, if you guys aren't familiar with each other, because we're all coming from different places, different walks of life, maybe introduce yourself, maybe share where you're from or what kind of space you work in, whatever you care to. And I'd also love it if you could share one way you hope to use storytelling in your work. And I'm hoping that you are, because you chose to use your time to come here today. And I know you could have used your time in many other ways. So we'll just take a moment or two and share that. And Seth, if you could read out some that come along as they are entered, that'd be great.
I see some folks are typing away. I use storytelling in my work to connect with educators across North America, and try to be vulnerable of why I do this work and the places that I care about, how they've been impacted or will be impacted by climate change. So I'll wait for a couple more to come on in and I'll read those loud. Trina is joining us and is building a network of climate change educators across Florida, and educators are looking for ways to allow students to share their stories about experiences like hurricanes, flooding, and other impacts, part of a trauma-informed curriculum. Gina is hoping to use storytelling with educators throughout Wisconsin to help them understand how storytelling can be a tool they can use to engage their students in learning about and understanding about climate change. Emily is a content creator for Subject to Climate that provides free resources and hopes to incorporate these ideas into their work.
Wonderful. And I mean, Seth, if you'd be willing, I don't know if you already have, but if you put that prompt in the chat, as folks, take time, you feel free to answer that question at any point throughout this. I'm really curious about what folks are hoping to get out of this and how they see storytelling fitting into their climate change education work. Now we're going to do something a little bit more creative. And I'd like you to take about 5 minutes to really think, what does climate change look like to you? And if you just take some time to draw, once that 5 minutes is up, those who care to can hold their drawing up to the screen and share that with us. You can always put it on Twitter and hashtag or add us. I love seeing these drawings because everybody's are always so different, and it is helpful to, get an understanding of how people are contextualizing and envisioning climate change. Okay, we're going to about wrap up your drawings. I'm going to briefly stop sharing my screen so we can get that nice grid view. And if you're comfortable with it, I'd love for those who have their camera on, if they could hold up their drawing and let me see. And if one or two brave souls feel like coming off of mute and telling us a little bit about your drawing, I welcome that. If you want to raise your hand, no need to share, but I find these are always really fascinating and help us ground us in why we're here and start thinking about what our climate story is.
Okay, I'm pretty brave. Hi, everybody. I'm Nancy.
Hi, Nancy.
I live in California, where our town was featured this week on national news because we're having this major flooding, right? And many of our bridges have washed out, but fortunately we're on a hill. But what I've noticed, climate change to me, just noticing the forest above us. We have a cabin up in the forest and we've owned it for 8 years, and just watching the forest transform from like mixed coniferous with sequoia trees, and really seeing it in these past 8 years change over to more of a black oak woodland, and very, very few. We've had more than half of our conifers die up there. And like that has really made an impression on me, seeing that forest transform in 8 years. And then just being aware that the students that I've worked with are worried and angry about the situation.
Yeah, who's going to be as brave as Nancy? No pressure, really, though.
I'm sorry. Okay. This is for my uncle who died at 96, and our family goes back generations as farm managers in central Illinois and Iowa and Virginia, just going right across as pioneers. But I'm an ecologist and a sea level rise. So climate change has been something I've been studying for decades since I graduated college and taught environmental education and park naturalists. The point I'm trying to make is it's supposed to be like corn, sun, flowers, horses. I think I saw it like going, or the beauty of the earth. That's a terrible thing. You can't see that. But the thing is I feel like I'm living now what our family grew up in, these flat cornfields, these beautiful fields, Drummond soil, the best chocolate soil in the planet practically. And I feel like I'm in a tragedy because the change needs to happen. And I keep going to these regenerative and soil and eco restoration and, learn more, and it's just, it's almost like I want to cry when I'm driving around because I could see remnant prairie species, the cemeteries have them. And I'm like, I don't know how we're going to get to the future because they got a great aquifer here. It's really deep. They don't have to worry about that stuff. They got the water and they feel like they're the corn basket of the world. Soybeans, corn. Anyway, so I just wanted to share that because when I brought this to the funeral and I gave it to my cousin, the daughter, I'd helped with my uncle in the last 3 years because he was living at home and all that. Everyone loved it. And I'm like, of course they love it. This is like the greatest thing ever. But inside I'm like, it needs to have something different. But I didn't put that in the collage. Okay, that's my sharing.
I want to just take a moment and thank Fawn and Nancy because they just demonstrated something that we'll get into later today, which is about how talking about climate change can bring up emotions of grief and despair and hopelessness, but also, we're all in different parts of the country and yet we're all eyewitnesses and experiencing it. And by sharing something as I'm scared or I just want to cry, right? You're being vulnerable and you're being brave to allow other people to be vulnerable and share that experience. I'm jumping the gun because you guys are just killing it and just helping me so go down that path. We'll get more into that, but thank you for being models for what we'll get into later today. You guys are naturals. I will do what I asked of you and share my drawing. I drew this a couple of years ago. So this is an activity that I was asked during an interview, and it's something that's open source. So, take this as you wish, incorporate it into your own climate change education if you'd like. As you see, it's a really great entry point into starting to think about your personal connection to climate change before you even get to the writing part. So I drew this because I think of the world as on fire. I mentioned coral reefs bleaching in my home and erosion from hurricanes, as well as farmers that are living in times of extreme drought not seen in several generations. And so the "why have you forgotten me" speech bubble is both the earth, like why have we as humans forgotten every other living species on the earth, right? That extractive mentality is what got us here to begin with. And why have you forgotten me, the child of colonialism and a modern day colony of the US, so it's I really think about the most vulnerable and marginalized communities and how, they contribute the least to climate change, but often suffer the worst consequences, as well as all the other species that make up this big, beautiful world, right? We're but one species and we have forgotten some of the others. So that's my drawing, and that's what climate change looks like to me. So to get into the more content stuff, we'll start off with grounding in some 5 key facts about climate change. We know that, and then I'm sure everyone in this room is in agreement, but just set the record straight. We know that climate change is real. 97% of climate scientists agree that it's real. It's happening now. We literally just in the last 5 minutes shared the impacts that we've all seen already. So we know it's happening now, and it's not something for tomorrow's generation or far off in the future. In fact, people have been experiencing the impacts of climate change for decades. You just have to look to the Maldives, a small island developing state in the Pacific that is literally going underwater, to know that this is something that has been happening, is continuing to happen, and will get worse if we don't do something about it. And humans are causing it, so we are the ones that have to do something about it. It is fundamentally driven by fossil fuel economy. And while our small collective actions can make a difference, we know that we have to hold those fossil fuel companies politically, socially, and economically responsible for the destruction that they've caused. And it's urgent. We cannot afford to not act. Communities that were buried in snow in California this week, or they're under flooding, like Nancy's, cannot afford for us to wait. The Maldives cannot afford for us to wait. My island, that was struck by 2 Category 5 hurricanes back to back in 2017, 5 years ago, cannot afford for us to wait. And it's communities of color and low-income communities that are the most urgently in need for us to act. And finally, to ground us in a little bit of hope after all those urgent and doomsday messages, is that we know we have the solutions. Action on climate change is happening all around us. There are groups and individuals around the world doing incredible, amazing things with very little resources, and it's absolutely inspiring. I'll take a moment I used to work on a program called Multisolving, MULTISOLVING. I encourage you to look it up, because that gives great examples of folks that are using small investments of time or resources to create large impacts in how people interact with each other and with the natural earth. We can take a pause here, and if a couple of people want to share some examples of solutions you've seen in your community. I know one solution I've seen in my community back home on St. Croix is that following that hurricane I mentioned, Hurricane Maria, which came about 5 years after the closing of an oil refinery named Hovenza. For decades, since the 60s, there had been a disinvestment in the local agriculture. Every single year, the Department of Agriculture's budget shrunk. And since 2017, there's kind of been a reckoning of how are we really building our society, and what do we really value? And I actually did my senior thesis on Virgin Islands agriculture in 2016. And little did I know that there'd be a whole 180-degree shift, where there's just been a giant back to the land movement on St. Croix, where they're really investing in regenerative agriculture. They're creating farmer cooperatives. Local grocery stores that emphasize local produce are popping up everywhere. Value-added products such as shea butter and honeybee wine. It's quite impressive. Next. Oh,
I was just going to say a couple of the things that were shared in the chat.
Yeah, please.
Were transition from diesel buses to electric buses in some school districts, advocates for zero fare regional bus systems, school-wide waste management, composting, restoring riparian habitats as adaptation.
Wonderful. Yes. I'm especially a fan of like restoring natural environments, especially in urban centers, because we know that they're so helpful for cities, green spaces. Food justice and agriculture was my gateway into this, so I'm always like goo goo gaga over green solutions. Because also, doesn't it just feel nice to be in greenery? Okay. What is the importance of talking about climate? According to the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, opinion polls say that now 70% of Americans say that they are concerned about climate change and know and think it will cause harm to future generations as well as causing harm today. Yet less than a third of Americans report frequently talking about climate change. So we know there's a disconnect between people feeling very concerned and thinking about how it's impacting their lives today and how it will impact the generation of tomorrow, yet no one is talking about it. And that's a bit paradoxical, because one of the best things we can do to address climate change is to talk about it. After all, talking about things influence public opinion, and public opinion drives decision-making. Next, the power of storytelling. For a long time, the way we have talked about climate change has tended to be very scientific centered, especially carbon centered, reducing carbon emissions. And while the science is essential and undisputed, it is through stories that we can contextualize and start to wrap our minds around what that science means. Research shows that showing people research doesn't work. You can rattle off the amount of degrees that the earth is warming or the amount of, retreat of glaciers, but what does that mean, right? And somebody's personal story, like our founder, Will Steger, who saw an ice shelf collapse in the Antarctica, excuse me, that it was never going to collapse in his lifetime. And then it did. And he told that story. He traveled and told that story. And that was much more impactful than simply saying this ice shelf collapsed, collapsed, or these glaciers are retreating. Next, as we already covered when we drew what climate change looks like to us, we are now all eyewitnesses to climate change. Perhaps, it was a more isolated experience in the early aughts, but now in 2023, it is undeniably all around us, right? The heat wave that hit the Pacific Northwest in summer of 2021 was a 1 in 50,000 year or 5 million year event. And predictions are that it will become a 1 in 10 year event by 2050. Climate change is happening around us, climate change is happening all around us. And we all have a story to tell. We're often told or made to think that it's the person in the front of the room, like myself, that's the expert who you should listen to. But the best way to reach the communities that you're a part of is by telling your own story and helping them find their own connection to climate change. Your students and the people that you work with can all be leaders and change makers in the climate change movement. They all have a voice, and a way to help them recognize that they can be leaders and change makers and that their voice is powerful is by tapping into their personal climate story and experience of it. Again, it helps balance the science. It helps contextualize the reality of climate change and make it not so abstract or vague. It brings it down to, the personal lived experience. And again, as we covered so wonderfully and early in talking about our climate change drawings, is that it's a great process to start acknowledging and addressing grief. I think one of the reasons that a lot of people don't talk about climate change is because once you start, you're faced with the daunting task of trying to combat it and overcome it and stop it. And it is a daunting task, but hopelessness is not an option, especially for the most marginal communities. And so we have to work through that grief and reach a place of resolve and empowerment and inspiration to act, because we have no other option. And it's tough to do that when you're held back or frozen by this grief. So by tapping into it, acknowledging it, naming it, and connecting with others of hey, we're all feeling kind of sad about this. There's power in that. And there's, a way to move from that into collective action. One example of this, again, I'm just all about that agriculture. So I'll be hitting you with those examples. In 2005, the International Rice Research Institute used a radio soap opera called Homeland Story to persuade millions of rice farmers in Vietnam to stop spraying their crops with harmful insecticides. Farmers who listened to the series were 31% less likely to spray their crops than those simply told not to. That's pretty powerful. And this is kind of off the cuff, but it made me think just now of some Pulitzer Prize winning, I can't remember if it was investigative journalism or documentary making, but it came out about Black lung disease in Appalachia. And we had known about Black lung disease for a long time. There were known risks, right? People talked about it. You could rattle off the numbers. But this story of these people's real lived experience and the impacts of coal mining on their health and their lives and the lives of their family and communities galvanized a movement, and brought so much attention to what their plight was. And so these are just a couple of examples of how narrative and storytelling can really inspire people. And yet, a climate story, there's no right or wrong way to write a climate story. It is anything you want it to be. It is the story of, like Dawn shared, her ancestors, or it is the story of watching trees over 10 years, like Nancy shared. For me, it's about hurricanes and drought and moving to the mainland. It's going to be different for everybody. And it also takes different forms. It might be writing a typical op-ed or blog style post, but we've also had people write stories that were poems or prose or songs. A climate story can be a film or photos with captions. It can be actual just music, right? We had one delegate that we sent to the international climate negotiations that wrote songs and like music that evoked what climate change meant to him and his climate story. And we've gone over this a little bit, but just to bring it home, why climate stories? Well, it helps break the spiral of silence. It, we might be afraid to talk about climate change because it's difficult or it's taboo or it's been politicized. But by approaching it from a storytelling aspect first, instead of a hard science aspect, we can make that personal connection and then hit them with the facts, It can also discourage internalization of despair and anxiety, combat pluralistic ignorance, helps you know that you know your lived experience better than anybody else. So you are a trusted messenger with credibility in your own sphere of influence. It builds self and collective efficacy, because the more we talk about climate change, the easier it becomes. The more people we talk about it, the more other people are going to talk about it. It creates a network effect. And it's a tool to educate, connect, advocate, and overcome some of the challenges of combating climate change. I think we're doing good on time. So if folks are game, this is just a 30-second, you can turn your video off, but literally I'm going to ask you to stand up and we're just going to reach our fingers all the way up to the sky. You can stand or sit, whatever feels comfortable, but reach them, reach them, reach them. And now drop low, low, low. Go as close to your toes as you can. And then wiggle it out. I know research says that showing people research doesn't work, but there is research that says getting up and moving at least once an hour is very good for you. So, Seth, I'm glad you like that. Okay, and so that's about, contextualizing climate stories in the broader idea of climate change. But y'all are interested in the Teach Climate Network. So you're coming from an educational standpoint. So what does climate storytelling mean for you as an educator and in the classroom? Well, first of all, climate stories, learning about the diversity of students' lived experiences and how they see and make sense of the world is important for educators. They're a great way to learn about the diversity of students' lived experience and understand how they make sense of the world. Framing climate change when you're trying to do a lesson or educate or talk to your students about climate change, framing it in the context of stories can help students understand the way it personally affects them. So it kind of goes both ways, right? Hearing a student's climate story helps you understand how they make sense of the world, and having a student discover their own climate story helps them realize how they're making sense of the world in which climate change is a reality and affecting them. And at the beginning, I mentioned vulnerability and being brave, and I thanked Nancy and Dawn for modeling that, because I think while not strictly necessary, it's powerful for you as an educator to first do the reflection and discovery of your climate story and your connection to it, and share that with your students, perhaps prior to inviting them to discover and work through their climate story, because these things can be vulnerable and, you're bearing a part of your soul. Some of these things are highly personalized. My climate story is about that hurricane hitting my island, and I was thousands of miles away in the mainland, and my family was there, and I felt so helpless. And it's difficult to talk about, but it's also not a unique experience, right? And so by like showing a little bit about your heart and how it's affected you, that helps students feel brave and comfortable and open, sharing their own personal experiences. It builds rapport with them and it helps build trust with them. And now we're going to go into a little bit of discussion. I have a couple of questions I wanted to ask you, but I'd also am just interested to hear how people are feeling and what they're taking away from this. And yeah, I say here in chat, but also please feel free to come off mic. We've got a small group. Happy to hear from folks that have contributed already. Happy to hear from new folks, but I'd love to take some time to you to think about what your experience talking about climate change is prior to today, both personally, and if you have brought it into your work as an educator or other work that you might do before. And let's, see where that goes. I'll give some folks some time to think about it, and you can feel free to answer in the chat. Seth will read some out as they come in, but also feel free to raise your hand. And
I'm not sure how to raise my hand, so I hope it's okay that I just share. I clicked on a button that looked like a hand and did not see my hand go up. But I'm now working at the Center for Environmental Ed, working with K-12 educators, but had been working in the classroom for in the middle school classroom specifically for 10 years prior to this. And I worked in a community that tried to do a climate expedition, like an interdisciplinary unit with middle school students, educating them about climate. And when we tried to do it initially about 10 years ago, the first time, the community is relatively rural, small, fairly conservative, and we had a lot of pushback from parents. And they claimed we were being too political and we were trying to, ingrain things in our students that we shouldn't be doing. And so we kind of circled around after that experience was done and talked about how we could do it differently and not, create so much conflict. And at the same time, Kat Techman, who's worked with Climate Gen in some of their presentations, was doing a week-long GWAL workshop talking about the impact of climate on culture and how it was impacting the Ojibwe people. And we went to that workshop and learned from it. And that was the whole thread that we brought into our learning after that, was how is climate impacting other cultures, and how does climate impact things that are a part of our culture and some of our traditions. And from that time on, we did not receive any complaints from parents, because when kids came home and started saying, hey, what was it like? Snowmobiling was big in our community, and they talk about that. And they're like, oh yeah, the trails, once they opened, they never closed in the winter. And now, they closed several times. And so even if it was, through just these little bits and pieces that weren't as critical to life as culture was to the Ojibwe people and is to the Ojibwe people, it changed the way the conversations were taking place. And then we could bring in the science and the data and the evidence after the fact, and people were willing to listen to it.
that makes me think of a conversation I had a couple months ago with someone, and a story they told was that growing up, their birthday's in January, and growing up, every year that they could remember as a child, they had a sledding party for their birthday, and that's just not possible anymore, right? That's a 2-sentence story that says a lot.
And Nancy shares that 10 years ago, her boss or supervisor told her not to talk about climate change, and she ignored them, but really started just asking, how do we manage this area or this ranch in a changing climate, code word for climate change. And now it seems everyone is much more comfortable or understanding of the importance about talking about climate change. And Nancy really wants to help people move through this and embrace climate change.
So sea level rise, post-Pleistocene, it's been going on, right? It's natural. It's part of the Earth's ups and downs, hothouse Earth, frozen ball, snowball Earth. So when I did it, it was just part of what drove Barrier Islands to migrate inshore as they wash over with storms. And And then I was a park ranger there for the National Park Service, and it was part of the story, but it was one slide, meaning it was just part of, an inch a century or, very little amount. Well, now it's a huge thing because there's been an overwash with Tropical Storm Sandy, 3 places, 2 closed up, 1's left, Old Inlet. And it's research, it's amazing. There's oysters now. The whole Great South Bay ecosystem is changed. And it's exciting, but it is the change that was not even thought of being hardly noted upon back in the 1970s. I'd do a campfire, this slide come up, and I think I had like one person in 4 years come up and go, "What is that about? I didn't even understand that." They didn't really get it. I think we're very used to a fixed world. We're used to, like, you put in the house, you put in the pier, you put in the National Park Service Visitor Center, the ferry comes, it's all great. And then suddenly, I think now we all are like, changes are occurring. And that's part of my spiritual journey. And that's just part of what I'm trying to understand on how to interpret and talk spiritual teachings with an understanding of how this change is part of what we need to incorporate and how we look at our stewardship. That's what I wanted to say. Okay. That's my story.
I saw another raised hand. Yes, thanks for sharing, Fawn. You've been great today. Everybody's been great. I saw, I think, a raised hand. Sorry, Jennifer, if it wasn't you when I called you out on the chat. Okay, it was. Cool. Can you please, feel free to go off mute and share with us.
Yeah, sorry, I haven't been participating much. I'm having trouble with connection issues. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
You can't see me? Okay, well, I'll just say anyway. So it's interesting how when we used to have proposals that we would fund every year. I'm at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it was for the watershed councils to do climate change stewardship work and monitoring climate change, like temperature and rainfall. And an interesting, like, as soon as the administration changed, not the one, but the last one, all of a sudden, because it had the words climate change in it, it was no longer funded. And then all I did is take out the words climate change and put in like community stewardship, and boom, it was funded. Like, we were doing nothing different. I just find that so interesting. And I just want to say too, I really appreciated this discussion. I've put together a climate change presentation for middle school to high school students. And it was all kind of facts, figures, graphs, and it just didn't land as well as Leah Schroetz is, I think, her last name, at the Fish and Wildlife Service. She put together a PowerPoint that has more about telling our story through the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's about impacts to species. And so I think that's the route I'm going to take next time.
Great. And I'm actually sorry, I freaked out because my computer froze for a second. So hopefully everybody can still hear me. I'll be sharing in a few minutes as we close. I could keep talking to you guys for a while. I was worried about, I'm going to be transparent and vulnerable too. I was worried about an hour, but now I'm like, oh no. I'll be ending with sharing some resources for, a classroom storytelling lesson that you can take to educators that's suitable totally for middle school and high school, Jennifer, if that will be of use for you. Okay. Is anybody else wanting to share? Because we had another little interactive thing we could do. I'm going to share my screen again. I would like for folks we're going to talk out loud or again, put in the chat. And I'm going to add some stickies here on this lovely template that our communications coordinator made for us at Climate Generation about what you're taking with you today. I know we've only been together for 48 minutes, but hopefully you are taking something away, open to hearing if you're not. But yeah, I'd love to, just maybe some words, how are you feeling right now? What is this bringing up for you, if anything? Sentences, single words in the chat or off mute, and I will add little text boxes as we go.
And I can just share, Cassandra, because I'm not sure if you can see, but just that stories are more powerful than facts. Telling stories is probably more important than stats. always want more stories, that you're not alone in sharing all of this, that it's good to know that there are people out there communicating and sharing stories around climate change with students, that there are already great resources out there on how to best make personal climate stories, and really loved the phrase of spiral of silence. Many of us have been stuck there, and it is our duty to help ourselves and each other break that. A question, wanting to prompt students to share their climate story, but also wondering, then what? How can we have them take that next step?
That's a good question. By next step, I think I'd like to know what by next step, because I think there's more than two kind of there's several pathways forward, right? One thing at Climate Generation that the Talk Climate program emphasizes and would love to see is people discovering their climate story, writing it down, or audio or video recording it, and then using it to go testify at your local hearing, or write a letter to the op-ed, or take it home to a family. I mean, the person, Trina, you live in Florida, and my heart goes out to you, girl. That is a rough place to be right now for many reasons. And I think it's super powerful if, middle schoolers in Florida, there's a large Latino community in Florida, an increasingly conservative Latino community in Florida. And if those students were able to go home and bring their climate story and talk to mommy and papi about it, that would be super powerful, right? And so maybe encouraging them to, my answer, I think, is that it really depends on where your students are at in life, what their interests are. I think for me, the idea that something has to be done with a story is sometimes in conflict with the idea of being in harmony with the earth. As a person of color, as a queer person, I've just tapped into grief and traumatizing experience of my family and island going through this hurricane. And I see a little bit of hope on the other side after discovering my climate story. Isn't that enough for my cup to just be refilled? So it really depends. I think the answer is different for every single person and every single student. And I'll share in a moment that the resources I promised, and my email is one of them, but it's simply Cassandra@climategen.org. And my job is to work with people to help discover their story and coach them through it. One of the first things I got to do in this position was work with some of our delegates that went to that international conference, and their stories literally brought tears to my eyes. It was so powerful, and so happy to do the work, to work with any of you on any kind of personal or more nuanced and focused work that you might be interested in. Because I do want to share some resources with you again, I will once again share screen. Hopefully I'm not discombobulating you too much, but we have our Talk Climate program page. So that's just climategen.org/talk-climate. And from there, you can find the Discover Your Climate Story subpage that includes our writing prompts. I didn't get into our writing prompts today because I knew we would only be together for an hour, but we have a whole series of prompts for reflective writing that can help people start to discover their story. Again, that's not the hard and fast way. That's just one way. And I'm happy to work with people individually or groups to think about what's best for their students and their space. There is also, again, this resource library, climate storytelling lessons for the classroom. Can you guys still see my screen? And so you see this beautiful PDF. Great. So you can go to our resource library on the website and download this. And this is just a little preview. See grades 6 to 12, Jennifer, though that's your peeps. You just need a journal and a writing utensil. And here are the prompts that I mentioned. Outlines all of it for you. So really it's just a download and go resource to help your students start discovering your climate story. Asterisks, I still think it's, powerful for you to discover your climate story first and be able to start with sharing that with your students to open the door for vulnerability and say it's okay to talk about the tough stuff. And then reach out to me. I'm also a resource. So you can reach me at cassandra@climategen.org. Seth, I know you have a couple of slides, and then hopefully we have some time for questions. But again, if you have any questions that we don't get to today, feel free to reach out to me. I'm a bit busy this month, but I promise that I will try and tend to each and every one of you, because I'm just so appreciative that, again, you took an hour of your time to come and learn about this and care about this. I'll hand it back over to Seth.
Yeah, I'll be very brief, but just in case you haven't already signed up for our Teach Climate Network, which includes these professional development workshops, monthly newsletters, and other opportunities, I just put a link in there. Cassandra, you can go to the next one. And then our next workshop will be on Thursday, April 20th at 5 o'clock, where we're joined by Sarah Johnson from Wild Rose Education. And Sarah will be sharing some of the experiences she has of collecting climate change observations and data in the Arctic. And just sharing some of the challenges, but also some of the successes in taking that and sharing it with wider communities. So hopefully you can join us there. And I think we can open it up for any questions. Thanks so much, everybody.
And just quickly, sorry, Fawn. Seth, could you put in the chat a link to this to subscribe? Maybe you guys are probably already subscribed to the Teach Climate Tips, but I write a monthly newsletter called a Top Climate Digest, in which I have like a little bit of a letter that speaks to a theme of the month. I'll highlight some powerful stories, like climate stories, offer a reflection prompt, all under a theme. So January was the first one. That was about storytelling for all, kind of setting the intention of what I hope this program to be. Last month was about celebrating Black history and Black stories every day, all year long, not just for 1 month of the year. And this month, in honor of Women's History and Trans Day of Remembrance and Visibility that happens at the end of March, that'll be the theme. So sign up. We'd love to have you. I hear people enjoy it. But I'll open it up to questions now. And I'm able to look at the chat, Seth. So Fawn asks about phenomena storytelling resources. I'm not sure I understand.
Well,
What do you mean by
I'm still right there at the beginning, but this has become something really in education with meaningful watershed. Noah's teaching it, and it's phenomena, climate change storytelling and teaching. And it's, so I can't really answer your question. I'm just still right at the beginning learning.
Well, I guess I'm joining you at the beginning too. So I haven't heard of that yet, but I will. I'm somewhat new. I'm based in Baltimore, Maryland. I'm still somewhat new to this state. So if there's somebody doing cool work in storytelling, yeah, and maybe you'll even be happy to connect me.
And Fawn, I will try to include in our follow-up email one of the resources that Climate Generation has put out. It's a little old, but that's originally where a lot of our curriculum started off with, was phenomenon based, as Cassandra said, about Will Steeker's expeditions of going to these places where it was actually happening, and talking a little bit about how we can bring that back home. We have one that's Minnesota specific about our changing climate and seeing those phenomena happen. But we know that other states can pretty easily take some of those lessons and adapt it to what they're seeing or what their students are seeing related to bird migration, ice in, ice out dates, invasive species, all of that fun stuff.
It's really, I think, the whole place-based education idea. So the phenomenon is not like a volcano in Maryland, but it would be something local.
And as I said, I will be sending out a recording, slides, additional resources in the next few days. But I want to say a huge thank you to Cassandra for being vulnerable and sharing about your own climate story and sharing with our educator network.
Yeah, it was my pleasure.
Everybody.